You're listening to Binjang 91.5, and now it's time for Tech Talk with Mathew Dickerson. I'm your host, Tony Graham. G'day, Matthew.
Yeah, good afternoon, Tony. Great to chat about technology, everything technology again.
Yeah. Now, coming to that juncture, now live streaming gives new life to funerals. New life, that's an interesting term, amid COVID-19 restrictions.
I thought that was one of your bad puns again, Tony.
Well, that was yours and I just highlighted it.
I actually had an incident many years ago, Tony, where a friend of mine had his father die, and at the funeral they had a large family and they had one of their family members who was overseas and they couldn't get to the funeral. And they actually asked me to set up some form of live streaming of the funeral specifically for that one person. So I basically set something up for them so that one person could be overseas and at least feel like they were somewhat part of the funeral. And it seemed like an interesting situation, and I was sitting there in the funeral and more looking at the technology rather than listening to the funeral, but I could see that it was actually some way for people to connect, because sometimes it's hard to be able to fly from wherever you might be. But it's changed now, obviously, with a maximum. Obviously, it was only a couple of people, now it's up to 10 people at a funeral. With only 10 people there, many families are larger than 10, especially if you start bringing in the extended family, the in-laws, the grandkids, the rest of them, and then you've got all your friends. I mean, it's pretty tough on people. And you don't want to be seen to capitalise on something like a funeral, but there are now funeral directors who are talking about offering this service not only during COVID-19, but on an ongoing basis. And so they've tried it with a couple already, and they've had up to 250 people watching this online at a time. And I actually really like the idea, because it's a big job to travel for your funeral, and you don't have a lot of time to plan for it. If there's a funeral, it depends how someone's died. You may not have any idea they're going to die. You might have some warning that they're on their last legs as such. But getting people to drop everything in their life and organise around their kids and their family and their work, etc., and get to somewhere is pretty tough. So streaming online, and again, I'd think you want to do it in a closed group in some way. Sorry.
Matthew?
Yes.
Sorry, mate. I just realised that we're not recording. How good is that? Well, I've done that before, haven't I? Lucky it's the beginning, isn't it? You ready to go?
Yep, sure.
You're listening to Binjang 91.5, and it's time for Tech Talk with Mathew Dickerson. And I'm your host, Tony Graham. Good day, Matthew.
Yeah, good afternoon, Tony. I've been sitting here on the edge of my seat for the last few hours after our morning session this morning. Just can't wait to talk about more technology.
I'm sure that is the case, because that's certainly the case with me. Now live streaming, and I use this term advisedly, gives, of all things, new life to funerals amid the COVID-19 restrictions.
What's our pun count for the day, Tony?
Yes. Well, that's your pun. No, it's a good one. Yes.
Yeah, good. Thanks. Look, many years ago, I had a friend of mine, and they had a parent that died, and unfortunately, they had a fairly large family. They had one of their members of the family, immediate family, who was overseas and couldn't make it home in time for the funeral. And they asked me to set up something so that they could actually have their family member overseas watch the funeral. So I set that up, and that was just a one-to-one scenario where that one person was watching. And I actually thought about it then that it was quite nice to involve them despite the fact they couldn't get home. When you think about a funeral, it's pretty tough to drop everything, your work, your life, your kids, all the rest of it, and then get to wherever you need to be, and you've usually got only a few days' notice. With COVID-19, obviously that's all changed again. We had our limit of a couple of people. Now we're up to 10 people at a funeral, but 10 people, gee, I hope I get more than 10 at my funeral, Tony. 10's not really a huge number to have at a funeral, but that's the current restriction. So some funeral directors are looking at live streaming funerals so that people can participate. There's been a few trials running already, and at some of those trials you've had up to, say, 250 people tune in and actually watch the funeral service. And I think that's really nice to allow those people to join in, and the 10 that might be at the funeral, I think would feel like they've got more support if they know that there are a lot of people online and watching. So it's actually changed the dynamic a little bit for a funeral director. It's changed the way they might organise it. And they've also had to bring in some external people. And for some people who might have been doing photography work, video work. Some of that work might be non-existent at the moment. So this is, again, another opportunity for some of those people to change what they're doing. And that's what I think we're seeing a lot with COVID-19, a lot of change. So there's hopefully none of our listeners have got to go near a funeral in the very near future, but it's a fact of life. It's going to happen. And again, I think some of those funeral directors will probably have that point where this will be part of the service they'll offer. And again, it'll be a decision the people who are burying their loved one would have to make whether or not they wanted to have that funeral live stream. But I think it would be a nice way for people to join in.
I think it's a good idea. Now, the world's fastest camera is frankly mind-boggling, isn't it?
It is. When you think about your normal camera might be 25 or 30 frames per second, and then you get some of the super duper slow-mo cameras on phones get up close to 1,000 frames per second. And then you see the super slow-mo guys that are doing things on YouTube and that type of thing that talks about tens of thousands of frames per second. We kind of think we're going pretty well. This new camera has got 70 trillion frames per second. And it's obviously very specialised. It's not something you take down to a game of footy on the weekend just to look at the technique of someone tackling or how they kick a football. It's used for some pretty specialised areas. For example, a nuclear reaction. What goes on inside a nuclear reaction? When you've got particles that are travelling effectively at the speed of light at 3 by 10 to the 8 metres per second, then you need a camera that's fairly fast to be able to capture that. So when you've got those sort of things you try and look at, this camera is the camera you want. Again, I don't think you'll be able to duck into a corner store and pick up one of these cameras, but it's just interesting to see the development. And what we see as consumers is when someone develops a camera for a very specialised niche that does 70 trillion frames per second, I think what we'll see flow down the line in years to come is that our 240 or 1,000 frames per second will get better and better because of the technology here, so that our little smartphone might be 5,000 or 10,000 frames per second using some of the technology, if you like, in a camera like this. But it seems quite incredible, doesn't it? 70 trillion frames per second.
Yeah, it certainly is. It's the marvels of science, and it'll no doubt be used in a big way in the science world. Now, next topic is clean green hydrogen could power a tractor revolution. And we've talked about hydrogen before for long distance travelling and transport, haven't we? Like we're talking about freight transport.
Yeah, we have talked about hydrogen before.
Apart from cars. But this seems to be the sensible next development, doesn't it?
It does, and there was a tractor company, New Holland, who released a tractor over in the US back in 2011 that was hydrogen powered, and that was in farms around, actually might have been Europe, around that sort of area around 2012. So it's not completely new to have hydrogen powered tractors, but the big issue is either the availability of the hydrogen to use or the cost of producing the hydrogen. And the cost in two terms: one is the dollar terms and one is the environmental terms, because it's not much good saying, hey, we've got this great new hydrogen powered tractor, that's going to be fantastic for all of us, but we've got a coal-fired power station producing electricity to actually get the hydrogen to put into the tractor. So one of the big things is getting those plants to produce hydrogen and make those green. We did talk about one before that was down in Tasmania, a proposed one down in Tasmania to produce lots of hydrogen for the world. Again, this one is talked about over in WA, where they're talking about having a hydrogen plant there, making it a very clean, green hydrogen plant. At the moment, they're talking about, again, it's probably more a proof of concept, being able to produce 25 tonnes of green hydrogen a day, so hydrogen produced with renewable energy, and that will be used specifically for farms, in tractors, that type of thing, not used for mass transport yet. But I think the idea is that if they can use that in farms, they can show that the concept works, then start to scale that up. So basically this particular company has raised $300 million for the first stage of construction. They expect that to be operational by the end of 2022, at which stage we'd be able to duck into the farm fields around WA and see tractors powered by hydrogen, where the hydrogen's being produced by green energy, and a big step forward, I think, in making it available, or different methods of propulsion available in our vehicles, including tractors around the world.
Yeah, I can't wait to see that technology develop. Now, the Tesla's next battery will make EVs cost the same as gas cars. So obviously they've improved the battery technology there, and probably would be transferable to storage of power for homes and that sort of thing too, wouldn't it?
A whole range of things here. And it was interesting, Tony, it was recently, we have a monthly meeting of the electric vehicles owners group around the Dubbo area. It's a group called Devious. And at the moment, we've got 3 members, so there's not a lot of members there at the moment. But at our last meeting before the shutdown or the lockdown, we were down at the charging stations in Dubbo and we were just looking at one of the cars that was there. And a person walked past us and he said, electric cars are no good. Hydrogen's the way of the future. And it's interesting because we just talked about hydrogen with tractors and I think long distance transport. I think hydrogen will be convenient because of the ease of refueling. But I still think there's a big place for electric vehicles in our motor vehicles and going forward. One of the big issues at the moment is whether it be a Tesla or whether it be a Nissan Leaf or whether it be a Hyundai, whoever it is at the moment, a large chunk of the cost of that vehicle is the battery, and a large chunk of the cost of the battery is the cobalt that's used. So there are companies that are trying to work out how you can produce batteries, get the chemistry you need without the cobalt. And there's a collaboration between Tesla and there's a Chinese company called CATL, and they believe they've got a battery solution that will essentially drive down the cost of an EV to, they're talking about parity. I'm not convinced about parity, but getting much closer to a gasoline vehicle car cost. The big thing, of course, is then the running costs are so much better in an electric vehicle. When there's a large upfront cost, it still scares people a bit, but if you can get that cost down and then keep those running costs at a much lower level, I think more and more people would be quite happy with electric vehicle. I think that ticket price is the shock value that happens at the moment. So that's interesting. But then on top of that, and there are already some vehicles that do this now, but what they're talking about with the Tesla is that you've got a power wall at the moment. You can put a power wall in your house. You can have your solar panels charge that power wall and then use that in your house at night time, for example. They're now talking about getting to the stage where you've got cheaper batteries in electric vehicles. You can have more storage in those, but then you can get to the point where you'll be able to plug in your Tesla and use that as somewhat a power wall in your house so that you'll be able to use that when your car's parked in the house. Why not utilise that battery to power your house overnight? So charge it up during the day. If you've got a day the next day where you don't need to use that whole battery, and let's face it, most people, and I'm an example of this, I've got an electric car that's got 630 kilometre range. Most of the time I use it for 5 kilometres a day. So you've normally got a lot of extra battery capacity, and the idea is why not use that? You've invested in the vehicle, take advantage of that and use that in your house to basically have it charging up with your solar panels and use it overnight. So a lot of developments happening here, cost of cars, flexibility of battery. I think it's a pretty exciting space to look at and keep an eye on going into the future.
Yes, now Tesla's also planning to cheapen the cost of this with their, by automating the battery production, aren't they? Yeah,
that's another part of it. And again, we really want people out there buying electric vehicles because, as with anything, the more any company is producing of something, the cheaper it becomes. And Tesla had a go at some automation with, say, their Model 3, and they still found that humans needed to be involved along the way. The build quality just wasn't good enough, leaving it completely automated. But they still think there's the ability to have complete automation in the production of their batteries. And battery production is a little bit less complicated in terms of the physical putting together of the batteries as opposed to an entire vehicle. So they still think they can do that. And if they can do that, that'll bring the price down. Once those numbers go up, that'll obviously keep the prices going down all the time. And the magic number is if you can get the cost of your battery down below $100 per kilowatt hour, that seems to be an area that is, I suppose, a real target for companies at the moment. In future years, we'll laugh about $100 per kilowatt hour. Oh, remember we used to pay $100 per kilowatt hour, but at the moment, that's the first target. And there are companies like Tesla they're really aiming for that to get that price, and that'll get to the stage where it's a reasonable cost.
And of course, the other interesting thing is there's other developments in battery production that uses alternative materials to lithium. So that's going to be interesting to watch, isn't it?
It's exciting because there are a lot of people around the world working on this holy grail of being able to produce a battery that's fast to charge, that's got high power density, so you can store a lot of there, and do it at a reasonable price. And if you can hit those 3 points and get those 3 points to a point, we talk about electric vehicles at the moment in decimal point percentage points in terms of market share, or in some countries 1 or 2%. Some countries they have taken over fuel powered cars, but in Australia, for example, 0.2% is the market penetration. But there'll be a point when we'll hit some of those magic numbers will come together, and suddenly it'll be, you drive a petrol powered car? Really? Why do you do that still? It'll suddenly make that jump, and we won't even vaguely remember what it was like driving a petrol powered car.
Yeah. And you'll be listening to Tech Talk with Mathew Dickerson on Binjang 91.5. And I'm your host, Tony Graham. Now stay tuned next week, the same time, 3:40 in the afternoon, and also in the morning at 10:40 for the next editions. And it's back to the great music and community information on Binjang 91.5.
Thanks, Tony. Talk to you next week.
Thanks, Matthew.